talk to other people and coming up with this concept, well, that's something for investigators to dig up.
Could some of the pressure on Rob Richer be coming from what he's currently doing? He helped to co-found Total Intelligence Solutions. That's the Blackwater intelligence spin-off with Cofer Black and others.
Yeah, well, you know, the fact is...
This means big contracts.
Yeah, Rob is a contractor and has been for a long time. At this point, much of his focus, and I think his time is spent largely with King Abdullah of Jordan, who he helped push up into his current status as the King of Jordan. And so, you know, Rob is a contractor. He has a mixed profile. Right now, he is with the King of Jordan.
Explain. Go back and explain how he helped to push him into office.
It's quite a story. The book is full of stories. I mean, people say it's like a movie. It's very cinematic because essentially it's sort of like America, the movie at this time of crisis. You know, Richer, back in, well, in the 90s, was a CIA operative, you know, in Jordan. In those days, King Hussein, then the King of Jordan, said, well, I have this young son. He's a smart guy, he's a little bit wayward, and maybe Rob is a bit of an older guy, maybe you could spend some time with him. Well, Rob Richer and Abdullah become fast friends, and Rob ends up being kind of a guy who helped shape Abdullah. At one point, you know, people inside of CIA are saying, you know, Rob is the man who makes Abdullah. Well, Abdullah, of course, is a strong-willed guy himself, and he rises up the ranks so that he actually becomes the next king. He's a dark horse candidate when King Hussein dies in 1999, and at that point, Richer is so close to Abdullah that essentially he is one of the most important men in the United States government. And that's the way it moves going forward. And that's why, Amy, because they have this honest broker, tell each other, friend-to-friend relationship, that's why we're able to set up Amman, Jordan, as the safe house for Haboosh to meet with the British intelligence chief. Rob Richer, of course, sets that up. That's part of the U.S.-British sort of joint effort here. All of it's laid out edge to edge in the book, you know, spy thriller fashion. Okay, let's go to Condoleezza Rice. Last week, Politico's Mike Allen asked the Secretary of State about your book. This is an excerpt.
There's a new book by Ron Suskind, which says the White House ordered the CIA to falsify intelligence about Iraq's ties to al-Qaeda. Is it possible the U.S. government forged a letter from Iraq's intelligence chief to Saddam Hussein?
The United States government didn't forge a letter. The White House in which I was working, and I think the people,
and they didn't direct.
And I think the people who he, as I understand it, the people that he quotes as being sources for that have denied it.
And so you think it's impossible that such a letter was created?
The United States, the White House, was not going to ask somebody to forge a letter on something of this importance.
And so you believe it did not occur?
It did not occur. The intelligence might have been wrong. That's now clear.
Right.
Not because people weren't working very hard, but when you have an opaque regime like Saddam Hussein's regime that had used weapons of mass destruction before, that had them before, one can understand how the judgment may have been wrong. But the decision to go to war was based on the strategic threat of Saddam Hussein, the fact we'd been to war against him before, the fact that he still threatened his neighbors, and the fact that we were told that he was reconstituting his weapons of mass destruction.
And Condoleezza Rice responding to your book. Ron Suskind, your response to her.
Well, Condoleezza Rice really ought to look hard and deep into exactly who was behind the letter that George Tenet receives that's passed down the ranks. Again, there is not a shadow of a doubt in the reporting. It is exhaustive, it is thorough, and it is in the book, on the record. At this point, though, the question is, will the White House engage in a kind of block, pushback executive privilege role as the investigations move forward? Or will they say, well, maybe we'll throw someone over the side, maybe we'll open up? Frankly, I think it's probably the former. Interestingly, here, what you've got is a situation where Rice is laid out in the book in a couple instances, including the fact that she's asked by Tim Russert in a key moment in the book during Meet the President 2006 when another Iraqi, you know, the foreign minister, that report comes out that the foreign minister had talked to the United States and said there were no WMD. He's a much smaller character than Haboosh, the intelligence chief. And she says to Tim, no, Tim, that was just one source who said that. That's a lie. It's just a lie. She knew all about the Haboosh mission. Everyone in the White House knew about the Haboosh mission at the very top. Obviously, she doesn't want to respond to that. And at this point, as you could see, as she sort of says, no, that couldn't have happened, you know, that is, again, what we learned during the Nixon years is what's called a non-denial denial. I have no knowledge. Not that I want to have knowledge, not that I've dug to find knowledge. I have no knowledge. And right now, what we're dealing with is a prickly situation that's both contentious, controversial, and tendentious politically.
What could the Senate Intelligence Committee, what could the House Judiciary Committee find out?
Well, they'll find out everything in the book is true, is what they'll find out. I mean, it actually won't be very difficult if they simply get people in under oath. You know, they'll have to duck or they'll have to risk perjury.
Ron Suskind, there are so many issues around the world that this book touches on and gives details about. For example, well, right now we had Iran in the headlines again today. You talk about the U.S. snubbing of Iran. Talk about what happened.
Well, again, everything in the book is specific. It is from comments of participants. Here we have an extraordinary moment in 2003. You know, you talk about why did we go into Iraq. Clearly, when you talk to neocons, what they do come up with is that it was a great experiment in behaviorism. The view was Saddam Hussein was actually an easy mark, that he was captive and toothless. That was the view. And we'll make an example of him to show other rogue dictators not to express similar temerity in challenging America. That was the concept, especially in terms of the fact that WMD are now carried on civil technology. You can't stop these dictators from getting weapons of mass destruction. There wasn't a way, essentially, to stop that from happening. So the word in the White House documents is how do we dissuade them, other people? Saddam would have been, that's the idea, the example. Now, interestingly, what happens at this point is, you know, as we are, you know, moving to war in this period, this snubbing of Saddam Hussein, this making an example of Saddam Hussein actually has a yield, Amy. The Iranians, once we have 150,000 troops in Iraq, are like, my goodness, well, their behavior is actually getting shaped. They say to the British, who they still have relationships with, they say, you know, maybe it's time for us to meet with the Americans. And they all but crawl across broken glass to say, can we help at this point? You know, we get it, all right? Interestingly, they were ready to help with al-Qaeda, which had a group inside of Iran under house arrest. The Shura Council that at that point was talking to a group of al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia about buying Russian suitcase nukes. All of that, of course, got people very agitated. Iran also said, we can help with Iraq, we can help with Afghanistan, we know these countries. What happened is, at this point, a CIA chief flies over there. He's not used to doing these sorts of missions. He's late in the flight. He gets the wrong hotel.
Jim Pavitt?
Jim Pavitt, that's right. He leaves the Iranians in a hotel for hours. They're calling up the Brits livid. The Brits are calling us, saying, where the hell is Pavitt? They're calling us. Ultimately, we end up snubbing the Iranians, and all but creating, at this moment, remember, this is the real men go to Tehran moment for the administration. We snub the Iranians and all but create the oppositional Iran that has caused such havoc in the years since.
Let's move from Iran to Pakistan. Right now, there's a big move to impeach the president of Pakistan. Talk about your findings in relation to Pervez Musharraf and Benazir Bhutto.
Just briefly, one of the big themes of the book is the enormous gap between word and deed, between official spoken morality and sweeping statements and the dark practices of the United States, all of which are coming out. You know, the fact is that doesn't work in a hearts and minds era of increasing transparency. It just doesn't. And ultimately, it bleeds away the most precious fluid, our moral authority, which is the source of true power in the world. The book says it again and again. Now, here's an example with Benazir Bhutto, who I spend the last 6 months of her life with. I'm seeing her all the time, talking to her sometimes every other night.
Why?
Well, you know, the fact is she ends up becoming, in a way, an agent of U.S. values, a vessel of them. You know, and Bhutto, of course, is corrupt right down to her socks, has been for years. She is a South Asian political boss. That's the way it works there. But what happens as it goes through these last 6 months of her life, she sort of inadvertently, as she says to me in her last days, we're in Quetta together, just before she dies. We're getting chased around town by suicide bombers. We end up in the house of a warlord, which is the only safe place in town. And, you know, and after all of our discussions, she's like, you know, Ron, I've been talking about these democratic values my whole life, but finally, just in the last month, I'm really starting to understand their power. part of it is Musharraf's missteps, putting her under house arrest, the terrible explosion in Karachi that killed 500